And then need to give us a sync. All right, cool. What's up?
Hello.
We have Angarika with us. And I think we're going to talk about fairness today.
Yes.
So why don't we just start out with you telling us what fairness is?
That's the worst and the most difficult question because when you think about so many aspects of a thing, it becomes extremely confusing for what the thing really is and how much it's constrained by the definitions that you give it. Actually, I was thinking before coming to the podcast that there's a generally accepted version of the definition of fairness, which is some sort of bringing about some sort of proportionality in the world. But every time you start looking at specific examples or specific situations where you want to ask this question of fairness, there's always so many other things that you need to take into account. Like one of the things that I work on is gender inequalities. And sure, there's a need for being proportional when you can, but then there's gender roles. And those gender roles, if they are legit and if they're bringing about some sort of efficiency, let's say, then you'll say, well, maybe it's also fair that people do their parts and maybe it's not equalizing exactly in inputs and outputs, and that's fine. Or if you look at fairness within the family, then again, there's roles and there's different expectations. And then again, it changes. So every time you go into specific examples, the definition keeps changing. And that's why it's so confusing.
Is it that the definition changes or that you just always need to build out an equation and the variables in the equation change?
Well, I don't know what the equation would be in that sense, because yes, you can add so a lot of people have been saying that there is this equation which takes into account some cultural variability or some situation specific variables, but nobody really spells out what those variables are. And then I don't know what equation are we talking about. So
I see what you mean. I guess for me, it's the fact that we can build an equation is the important bit. But ironing out a specific equation, I think that's going to be so context specific. The actual variables are going to be relative to everybody that are involved. But I think that we can say that maybe, for me, fairness and equality inhabit the same conceptual space because they're both basically terms in which we can have a midpoint, and that midpoint is called equal or fair. And that as you deviate away from that midpoint, you basically get like this ordinal ranking of more or less fair relative to the individual making the assessment. Mm-hmm. Or of course, you can have one of the absolute terms being equal or fair and then just deviations from it. Mm-hmm. But the way you would make that assessment on the scale is you build an equation with the relevant terms.
But think about it in the aspect of, let's say, a long-term friendship that you have. How possible is it really to figure out what's equal in the long term when there's two very different personalities who have different skills or likes? Like suppose you like cooking and your friend likes taking you out to the theater or something. How exactly do you even calculate the equality of costs and benefits? It becomes impossible if you start talking about these things in the context of anything that we experience in real life.
Yeah, I think that maybe we're coming from different hopes, different goals or objectives, in that I don't think that we can build an objective determination of fairness. I think that each of those individuals is going to maintain their own equation. And I think listening and maybe even something like couples counseling, like what that does is help you to understand the equation that the individual is maintaining in their mind. Mm-hmm. And so then what we can do when we're trying to reconcile a friendship or a relationship is that we're trying to understand each other's equations and why they seem imbalanced to one another. And then say, okay, well, I will do this to bring balance to the equation in your mind, and I'm asking you to do this to bring bring balance to the equation in my mind.
I still need for a matter of definition, trying to get myself into the conversation as well. So what's the difference between equity and equality? So are we talking about, in terms of equation, outcomes or conditions? So can you disambiguate for me equality and equity, and what's the relationship with fairness as you approach it?
So equality and equity, in the way I've learned about it, is equality is you bring all the inputs that people are putting in to an equal level and the outputs as well are divided up equally. So if you're, let me think of an example. Let's say the amount of food people are bringing to the table, and then the amount of food that gets eaten by everyone. If you can, let's say, count it by the number of calories or by the amount of food that you bring per gram or something, that would be equality. Equity is not saying that everything needs to be exactly equal, because perhaps sometimes you can't even measure how to equalize things. But if somebody's bringing in more to the table, that they get more in return as well. And I think that applies a lot in scenarios like jobs, where whoever's putting in more amount of effort or giving more value gets better and higher wages or a better position. That's how I would disambiguate between the two. But with regards to fairness, so I think fairness, there's like this huge debate going on all the time, whether fairness is about bringing absolute equality or absolute equity. There might be a few more people who say that it's more linked to equity in our minds than equality. But there's also a lot of people who say equality is what the human mind wants, and that's what it thinks of as fair. So
I have a strong opinion on this as well. Right? In that I think equity and equality are the same exact thing. In that these three terms, for me, they're the same thing. We just use different terms. But the important thing is that equity does have a different colloquial space. I think conceptually it inhabits the same space. Colloquially, we use it just in different contexts. But what we're basically doing is saying equality is, and fairness, I'm going to use them interchangeably, are basically the state that we try to reach. And that's a state where this equation that we might build balances out. Equity is when we accept that the terms that we're adding to the equation may seem unequal, but the attempt is to account for variables which are not seen in the present moment that will ultimately net out the equation. So equity is the process of building equality, but accounting for a larger scope of variables. Because typically when we look at equality, it's like, okay, well, I'm giving you $1 and you $1. It seems equal. I might say that, well, in this moment I'm giving Guilherme $2 and Angarika $0, and that is unequal in this exact frame. But I might say that's building equity because in the past, Angarika had more money, and I'm trying to give more money to Guilherme. So in this sense, to me, they're exactly the same thing. This also comes into, again, notions like social justice. When we're building in frameworks, we're saying actually the conversation is that if we maintain the status quo, we are maintaining an unequal state of affairs because we're accounting for a larger set of variables. What we do when we talk about equity is it holds sort of a different space in the social conversation, but it inhabits, I think, the same exact conceptual space, is that what we want is equality. But equality in the present moment doesn't bring true equality because we have to account for variables that are being brought into the equation.
So I want to ask you, when you're talking about this thing of maintaining the status quo in the present moment, that's, I think, a really good example, because there's all of the retributive justice programs which are in place in different countries in the world, like in India, where you have reservations for women, for different people of different castes, just because historically they've been deprived of a lot of equalities because of the caste system, let's say. So in that case, yes, I agree with you that you want to come to a level playing field eventually by giving them more advantages now because they've had less before. But again, if you're talking about this equation with the variables that don't really exist, you want to build up the model down up, I would assume, from down to top, right? I would assume.
Bottom up?
Bottom up, sorry. Yes, that's the term. Where you take a lot of examples and you try to see what are the latent variables that everyone is sort of accounting for when they want to build up to the model. But I think if you go from, let's say, the caste system to the gender system or to within family dynamics, it's going to be very hard to find the latent variables which are present everywhere in similar forms. And that's the sort of obstacle that I have been coming against. I look at a lot of theories of fairness, and then I try to use those theories to look at a very specific case study of gender division of household labor. And I mean, yes, on a very broad level, if you abstract out enough, you can see how the theories could account for the sociological data in gender division of household labor. But if you abstract out a lot, and because I work a lot with anthropologists and I've understood the value of not always abstracting out from the details, I find it to be also a bit of a unsatisfactory approach to abstract out enough to come to this one equation which accounts for everything, because then you're missing out a lot of the details at the end.
So you shifted the conversation more to like the application of this work to policy. Am I getting it right? Because I don't disagree. I think that the large scale policies are always going to be a mistake. I mean, especially if you're looking at India with a population of 1.4 billion people. If you're implementing policies to build inequity to count for so many different cultural variables within 1.4 billion people, I think that's actually impossible. And I think that it's even impossible in the United States, which has 0.3 billion people in it. So this is a really good case for local governance and how you can say, okay, well, regionally, there are going to be different factors which account for the inequity which we might see. And I guess one other note is when we look at certain systems that have historically tried to do this, Marxism is one of those, which is fundamentally a statement of equity, which is to each what they require and from each what they can provide. Roughly that. I've for some reason blank on the exact phrasing, but this is a system which was built in and implemented to say, okay, we can build equitable systems, but we need to make sure that we're giving things to people that are actually needed, instead of saying, okay, well, we'll give everybody $5. We'll say they need more, they need less, and then actually asking from people what they can give. And I think that these are really important systems to try to build in. And if you're trying to reform a capitalist system or a system which has I think, like India, many different political structures, aside from different social structures, it's going to be really difficult. But we can do this on a local scale.
On the local scale, with help for that, you have to understand the very specific context in which you're trying to apply this larger equation in. So like now you brought up the case of for need. I think that's one of the things that have sometimes been equated with fairness, but not always. And yeah, I mean, I agree with you that it needs to be done on the local level, but then I'm just trying to figure out what it means for us to have this bigger theory of fairness if everything at the end, at the application level, needs to be done on the local scale.
I get what you mean. I think this is what I mean by we have maybe different objectives, in that I don't think fairness can solve anything. I think that listening and trying to build systems which are fair can do something. Like I think that we can make progress towards building an equitable / equal / fair situation. I think that this is definitely possible. I'm very optimistic, but I don't think that a theory of fairness will let us do that. The only thing that I think a theory of fairness, equity, equality will give us is understanding that everybody maintains their own equation. And so I think some of the most successful interventions for groups has been when we sit down, have conversations, listen to constituencies and say, what do you need? What do you feel? And then they tell us what they need, what they feel, and then we try to build policies reflecting that. And I think that bottom-up grassroots type of policymaking is very different and much more effective than the top-down, well, I think you need this, therefore I'll give you this, which is, of course, just another style of colonial mindset of I think you need this, and also this is what I feel like giving, therefore I will give you this.
You both mentioned something that you both mentioned different ways. The equality is what the mind wants. I would like to either of you to elaborate better if you want on what actually means to what the statement of the mind wants equality, and how can you be so sure of that? And but yeah, just another point of reforming capitalism, for example, and the proposal of universal incomes and things like that brings to the table the issues of defining where does those equations overlap? Are there any reconciliation between those? If everybody has their own equation, comes back to the first question: how can you be so sure that the mind really wants equality? And how can we meet the equations in the middle and still make sense of calling it equality if, from my perspective, what is needed most of the time is concession.
But concession can be a means of getting to equality, right?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So
once there is concession, there is some form of, well, the word implies that, right? That you took your equation and you're just giving up some part of this equation, saying, look, from my perspective, it could be fairer than that, but I am open to accept the imbalance over here. So then we can actually have some overlap between different equations of fairness, depending on the cultural background, social, or anything more specific.
Yeah, concessions and terms like concession and reconciliation are necessarily involved in the concept of equity. And equality and fairness, as long as we understand that they're broadly defined in the same sense, just used contextually differently in the colloquial sense, is that when we speak about what a concession is, we're saying, okay, well, we understand that the equation isn't equal. What we're trying to do is make the equation equal. Therefore, one person is adding something into the equation. They're giving up something, and that might make the equation more fair. And I think that this is a really important point when we also talk about accountability, which is that in order to have accountability, we have to have the side that is asking for the concession define what that concession looks like in order for the equation to be fair. Because you can't have the side making the concession determine what kind of concession to make. If I'm guilty of a transgression against you, I really need you to determine what accountability looks like for me. If I determine an accountability when I've transgressed against you, then I'm still maintaining power. That's still another form of transgression.
There's this one thing that I would now like to bring up, because now both of you have referred to this as well. And so I've been talking to the people that I work with on this, that a definition of fairness that we think is a lot more valuable, perhaps, is the concept of mutual acceptability. Bringing about some sort of mutual acceptability when people have been able to sit down together, then good sort of change, which makes everyone happy, has come around, or listening to other people, what they want. And I think, I'm not saying that this has got nothing to do with equity or equality, but I think this is more fundamental and this is more psychological. When you start describing fairness not as this top-down equation governing our lives and us trying to balance equate the balance sheet or in some way, but just having some sort of mutual acceptability of outcomes and of distributions and listening to each other for making that happen. And this is something that I, so far, am most happy with, more than having the equations of equity and equality in mind with fairness. And yeah, that's, I think, how I see fairness nowadays.
Yeah, as the process of coming to terms.
Yeah.
With the terms.
With whatever the terms of the equation. You're never going to leave the equation, though.
I like that.
Yeah, because it's nice. I mean, it's again, the equation is only a tool. But I think it's important to recognize that everybody has their own perspective. And I think that's why I keep harping on the idea of we need to understand what the variables are for everybody. And we need to understand what the relative values of the variables are too. If we're roommates and I do all of the cleaning in the apartment, but you wake up every day and you're like, you're great. You're adding that to the term, I'm getting compliments, but maybe they're unequal. And so all the variables in the equation, when we throw them in, we're going to have different weights to each variable. And I think that's a really important thing. It just gives us a framework to talk about the important thing. There is no ultimate equation. The only thing that is important is putting an equal sign there and understanding that on either side of the equal sign we put things. And if the equal sign isn't true, meaning if the two sides aren't equal, then we have a problem and we need to figure out what that is. And the discussions are the most important thing that we can do. That listening aspect, I think, is the most critical.
Yeah, the discussion part, yeah. I agree with that.
So would you say that the work is tending in that direction? Like the work on fairness that you're thinking about doing, is that going to shift more in a direction of the subjective aspects of fairness, or maybe that it is always subjective?
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. I'm doing it more and more because I'm working with anthropologists who are about collecting qualitative data, which can bring about these subjective perceptions a lot more than I think marking out sheets in an experiment can. And that really helps. I'm also doing experiments, which helps look at the behavioral outcomes that people, how people end up behaving in certain circumstances. But yeah, I think the subjectivity part I'm trying to bring forward. How much have I done it? I don't know. I think I've done it a little bit with the help of others. But that's the thing that we're trying to build. I don't know what larger theoretical thing is going to come out of it. We do have some theoretical ideas of how interpersonal relationships might matter and how looking at long-term aspects of these relationships more than putting people to interact one-on-one, those things are more influential for determining fairness. But yeah, that's the sort of thing we're doing right now.
So in your opinion, is fairness an innate drive of the human mind?
That's what you asked before as well, yeah. Yeah, I think being happy or content with an outcome or with the way of the world, if that can be thought of as fairness, I'm not exactly sure. So yes, there's contentment. Yes, people feel unjustified in a sense, and then they can feel angry about certain outcomes. And a lot of people would call that the sense of fairness.
But it would be expected that we would try to make it just something that seems as unjust against ourselves, right? Maybe what would be more interesting, it's see if that would be the case for us perceiving the treatment of others around us. So if we are innately bothered by unfairness that surround us, not exactly against us.
I think that's actually easier to do. If you see other people being treated in a way that you think is not correct from some higher moral ground, you can probably take steps to correct that. But when you think you are the perpetrator of something that you sort of know is kind of on the line, is not so unjust, you're probably wielding more power or hogging more resources or something, you are less likely to have that drive to make things fair, so to say, or make things balanced out. I think, so from the third person point of view, maybe we have a stronger sense of fairness than when it comes to our own selves, especially if we are the ones who are benefiting from it. That's the feeling I get. I've not actually studied this in a specific way, but that's the impression that I have. What do you think?
Well, the first thing comes to mind is Franz de Waal, the experiment with the capuchin monkeys. And what happens in the experiment is basically the experimenters train the capuchin monkeys with a task, which is giving a rock to the experimenter, and then they get something in return for that rock. And they have two capuchin monkeys just sitting beside each other, and while they're doing the same work, which is taking the rock, giving to the experimenter, they are paid differently. One gets a grape, and the other one gets a cucumber. And they prefer much more the grape, and the one that gets the cucumber gets really pissed with that. So, and the argument would go is that even newer monkeys would have a sense of fairness when there is a apparently unjust retribution for the same work in this situation.
But the question is, does a grape-getting monkey get pissed off?
No, the monkey that gets what?
The grape-getting monkey, how does that monkey react?
It reacts
it's a grape?
It's a grape. He likes the grape. He thinks it's fine. I think he's satisfied with it.
Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah, but we can think, right? If there would be a comparison between the two kind of payments, would that be still a reaction? which is not the case. So it's content with the grape when he knows that instead he could get a cucumber, right? So in comparison, the grapes, it's satisfying. If he would get a cucumber, when the grape wouldn't be a possibility, probably would be satisfied as well, right? So that's the case, having like some social comparison there, and that's why it brings fairness to the table, because it needs the comparison component, bringing something else that it wasn't there, which is the comparison between the grape and the cucumber.
Yeah, but it's not being fair in the sense that it's being angry for the person who's the monkey who's getting the cucumber. It is only angry when there is a better thing to be gained.
Yes.
And so the monkey which knows that there's a better thing to be gained and is not getting that, that monkey is pissed. The one who knows that he's already getting the better stuff is not pissed. So can you say that there's an innate sense of fairness in a way that everyone wants to distribute things in a similar manner?
Well, I'm not entirely convinced. For this experiment in specific, I think we can look at obviously fairness have been studied on primates in different ways. I would have to look it up, collection of what the results are, but not specifically for the capuchin monkey. That's not something that I think it's a little bit stereotypical. Well, the assessment is how pissed the capuchin monkey is. I don't know. I would still have to look at the other results from other fairness experiments on primates, but I could not settle it entirely.
No, but even if you look at this specific example, then it's still saying something that if there was a third monkey who was seeing this thing happening, they would say that, oh no, give grape to both or give cucumber to both. And when the monkey who's getting a cucumber is responding, he has the sense of feeling unjustly treated. But the third one, which is the one getting the grape, does not really care. And I think that's what you see in human societies. Yeah. And this is something that me and Ohan have worked on as well. That let's say when there's gender inequalities, or where there's caste inequalities, or where there's, I don't know, nationwide inequalities between a stronger nation and a weaker nation, the possibility that the stronger one feels really bad enough to sort of give up their own advantages is much lower. And then if you look at that advantaged person who's getting the better bargain in an unequal system, what can you say about the innateness of a sense of fairness which tries to move towards equitable distributions? I would say it does not exist in the advantaged party. But why is that not the case?
So I think there are a couple of things here, right? One is that everybody believes in justice if they don't have to give anything up. And this is an important point, and I think we see this in the capuchins as well. The other component, and this is interlinked with what I just said, is that privilege tries to maintain privilege. This is something that we see throughout how humans interact. Is if I'm benefiting from a situation, I am motivated to continue benefiting from the situation in that same way. And so I think one of the things that we need to try to build in is people understanding that the greater good is better for everyone. And so if I have privilege, that means that I'm benefiting and somebody's losing out, and the society that I'm existing in is worse off. I could be living in a better society if I give up some of the things I think are valuable. The society that I exist in will give me things that are much more valuable than the things I'm actually gaining from it, which is something like harmony and humans working together, the ability to not see people suffer, things like this. So these are just sort of like grand optimistic ideals, right? But another important facet of this is social comparison, where, like Guilherme said, if we anchor, there's this sort of like anchoring bias, which is if I see the first benefit or the first price cost of something, that's the one that sticks in my mind as the baseline. So if I see something that is good enough for me as something that I will get, like the cucumber, I guess, is less valuable than the grape. Yeah. So if I see just cucumbers, I'm happy with cucumbers. But if somebody else is getting grapes, I want grapes. And this is just the natural human state. And I think that this is why things like revolutions always come at times of more revolution, because revolutions inspire one another. They say, oh, other people can get more. I actually also want more. This is one of the great fights about, and this is why social justice catches on. This is why I think the Me Too movement like caught on, is people were like, oh, we don't have to put up with this state of inequity. We can hold the privileged classes accountable. And so this sort of process of accountability, whether it's, chopping people's heads off with the guillotine 250 years ago, or it's something like firing them from jobs, making sure they have to leave certain industries, putting them in jail. All of these things means that people looked at for holding people accountable. I don't like public assassinations or prisons, by the way. Just want to put that out there. But yeah, this accountability process ends up being a crucial means of trying to achieve justice. And I think that, just to wrap up, justice is, to me, again, with equality, equity, and fairness, I think justice is just the action. It's the verb. It's the adding of terms to an equation. And that's what we mean when we say justice. Because justice, I don't think that there's an overarching objective framework for justice. Like, I don't think there's an overarching objective framework for equality. I think justice is most easily defined as just the process of adding terms to this equation of equality, fairness, equity. Because it's when I'm actually saying, okay, well, I'm trying to build justice into it. The act of adding something is justice.
Okay. That I'm going to have to think about it to actually be able to visualize it. Justice as a verb. I like that, though. Verbs are way better than nouns in any case. No, because it just implies action, no?
Declarative statement. I love it. Yeah.
But I was thinking about you talking about the fact that the equations are basically part of the the grander scheme of things. So I think how I see it, if you want to bring about fairness in some sense, social comparison is really important. So the people who are at the top or who have a wider view of the world, maybe even people who have traveled, who have experienced different systems, they are the ones who can talk about all the necessary variables, if you will, in that equation, just because they can see more or they have seen more. And then by knowing which parts of the population to be brought into comparison, they can start providing information to people, like in the Me Too movement. If women are getting information about other women when there's already a similarity because they are the same gender, then that can bring about change and the dissatisfaction at the lower level, which eventually will lead to some changes in people's everyday behaviors. Because I think it needs to go sort of, top down, but also bottom up as well. And I think right now there's a lot of top-down talk and bringing about things like conversations or social comparison, giving people information about other people, just helps in bringing about that movement towards a state in which there's not huge power differentials between people.
Yeah, this kind of ties back to an earlier conversation Guilherme and I had about information, which is the reason why autocrats try to limit the amount of information that their people have, is so that they don't see anybody gaining anything else. This social comparison aspect is so baked into our understanding of how to rule autocratically that information is the first thing autocrats try to cut off. And this becomes the core of what grassroots movements do internationally. The whole internationalist movement across borders from the Soviet Union to Western Europe, people were doing crazy things like etching poems, which, by the way, as a poet, I mean, poems are usually the main form of resistance, disseminated through every resistance throughout in the past. But people were etching poems into X-rays. Like, they were saying that they were shipping X-rays, like medical forms, and they were literally etching like Chekhov's poems on X-rays so that you couldn't see it until you held it up to the light, so they'd pass customs. I mean, whole Russian texts were smuggled out so that people could get an understanding of what was going on. And in the same way, Western European sort of texts about authoritarianism and things like this were smuggled in to Russia. The same thing's going on between North Korea and South Korea right now. The same thing with Palestinian poets, Mahmoud Darwish, writing and disseminating through this whole connected network of poets that would disseminate information. It's so important because we understand what's possible through other humans.
I wanted to ask you, so what sort of levels do you think comparisons should be made or are fruitful to be made? So when you talk about comparisons, I'm thinking of an example of some conversations I have with my sister, with my friends, who are looking at social media constantly, let's say, and they're getting extremely demotivated almost, or aiming too high, or comparing things which are not really comparable just because there's some sorts of similarities. And yeah, so at what level, I completely agree that there should be some sort of social comparison in order to think about your own situation in a better light, but it also has its negative sides, which is the case with all of the social media inbred dissatisfaction and lack of self-confidence that people have come up with. What about that?
You bring up a great point. I mean, right now, and in the years in the past, social media companies have been on trial for this exact thing.
Oh,
they
really?
haven't called it social comparison, but the harm that I shouldn't put in air quotes. There's harm. The harm that social media companies have on teenagers is seen as the harm of social comparison. They say, oh, there are body image problems. The bullying is a separate case, but I think fundamentally the body image problems, the depression, the suicides, the eating disorders, these are all we've seen heightened through excessive social media use. And this is definitely the downside of social comparison. Because this is, I think, fundamentally also what materialist, capitalist economies function on, is every advertisement is an attempt to tap into social comparison. It is like, look at this guy. Don't you want to be this guy? Look at his wife. Don't you want to be with his wife? Use this deodorant. I mean, that's the basis of the consumerism that we build. And so again, I think social comparison is such a powerful cognitive reality, that advertisers have used it for millennia. It's both what has generated the greatest revolutions and also generated excessive subservience through consumerism. And this is the dual nature of the human existence.
I think we talked on this point. We talked about this point both on our talk about power and information, actually, because I think we kind of agreed by there on those talks that when we're talking about power, for example, and media or social media in this case promotes a way of you trying. It gives to you an idea of what makes you more powerful. So you look at this is the perfect body because it's the body that has more likes on Instagram, or this is the body that you should have because it gets more attention from people and more comments and things like that. So what we were talking about on those talks is just that, well, we are always looking for something that increases our sense of agency or being powerful, or how can I situate myself better here? And social media gives you true social comparison. So you are using a social comparison to say, okay, I have less power than this person because I do not have that body, or I do not have that car, or I do not have that things, right? But what it's basically doing is just like creating this environment that foster a specific kind of display of power, which is likes, recognition, or the best picture, the picture that has more comments or things like that. And it does that with many other things, like in advertisement. Well, that's the thing that would make you happy because that thing makes you more valuable. So you're looking for the things that make those things in reality, they might, or most of the time, not actually make you more happy, and it does not make you more valuable. But the environment, this vitrine, or where it's displayed, it's imperative that it is the powerful look or the powerful picture, the powerful whatever, because it's the way that it is presented to you. So it's one thing fits to the other, right? So you wanted that power, you wanted that prestige, or you wanted that thing. And the thing that gets more prestiged on this environment and the way that it's presented is this that you are looking at.
So then let me ask you a question, because this conversation is reminding me of this text I read by Amartya Sen. Do you think it's better to then not compare, not have comparisons at all? So Amartya Sen was writing about gender conflicts in different places. So he has studied I think he was in Oxford or in Cambridge, but he was a Nobel Prize winner. He's been in the UK. He's been across the world. He's from India. He's from Bengal, so he's seen, and he was from rural Bengal, I think originally. He was born and brought up there, but then he moved to Kolkata and then outside of India. But he's seen like a wide variety of socioeconomic and demographic situations. And in one of the papers about gender, he was writing that if you ask about what is fair or how you would bring about equity to a woman living in a rural part of Bengal who is happy enough with her family, she thinks of her own welfare in terms of welfare of the family members. The question of having individual welfare is itself unintelligible to her. And she's happy with that. And her her children possibly are prospering from that, and people around her are happy with that. That's just the way their social reality is constructed. And to her, would you want to give different values of social comparison where individualistic welfare is thought about? Because I think nowadays, of course, it's a Western thing. There's a lot of focus on individual-based gains, individual-based welfare, individual inputs and outputs and all of that. And for certain communities, maybe it was better to just let them be happy in their community because they were growing and prospering as a community. So, yeah.
No, I think just it is related how social comparison should be, or it can be beneficial. Obviously, it can be motivating. I think it has to be coupled with some idea of social distance as well. So athletes can be can compare themselves with other athletes, right? So and they can run faster, they can swim faster, or whatever they wanted to do, and it's good for them that they have a comparison to aim higher. But me as a PhD candidate, I may aim at comparing myself with a certain kind of person that I admire and I wanted to get to that standard, while I should not compare myself to Usain Bolt because it is socially distant from me, you know. So I don't want it to run faster, and I don't have to feel bad because I don't run like Usain Bolt, because it's just not within my selfish interest of advancing myself or becoming better. It's not gonna make me better within my social, cultural environment, you know. So you have to couple social comparison within your own environment, and it might be beneficial if you wanted to gain some insight on what's the potential that you can reach.
Yeah, I think it's a parable here that's used commonly for intelligence is relevant, where if you try to judge the intelligence of a fish by how well it can climb a tree, you're going to fail, right? Because it's irrelevant. And so there's a domain specificity, I think, for everything that we deal with. And this is, again, that difference of different degrees of difference. In that if Usain Bolt tries to compare himself to a cheetah, bad idea, right? But compared to other runners, one of the best. And so this is one of the things that we see. To Angarika's point, again, I think the idea here is that, again, structures for improving the lives of individuals have to be bottom up. They can't be top down. There's a great set of terms in the intersectional literature called benevolent racism, benevolent sexism. It's sort of like this indulgent attempt to self-gratify by attempting to impose what we think is betterment on the lives of others. Right? But it doesn't work because there's no way we can know what others experience. And so it has to be a conversation. There is probably a way to make in the case study that you mentioned of a woman in a household in Bengal, there's probably a way to make her life better, but she knows what that is. We don't know what that is. And if we come in and we're like, back where we're from, the women's lives are improved this way, it might be completely unintelligible. So this is I think one of the important things. But I was just thinking about a sort of interesting division while Guilherme was speaking earlier, where there's a difference between, when we're going to talk about social comparison, there's a difference between how I am, like my state, versus how I am seen, which is like my influence relative to others. And here, maybe we can make an interesting distinction between social comparison for justice, which is the social comparison in the positive sense, like revolutions, and the social comparison for power, which is often in the negative sense, like what we suffer through for commercials and social media, where with justice, I'm comparing my state relative to the state of others, like my ground state. And I think that's really important. And it's really beneficial when we're understanding our states of relative privilege or how we are relatively disadvantaged by a system, right? How we can better understand systemic injustice. But when we're looking at our influence relative to others, we're looking at the social comparison for power. And I think this isn't necessarily a toxic engagement with society. It's saying they have more power, I want more power. There's nothing good that has ever come from that. But there's so much good that has come from, their state is good, and I think I can achieve that state, or my state is good and their state is not good, and therefore maybe we can achieve a better equality.
But wait, so when you're talking about their state, I think their state necessarily includes the power component also. So if somebody's comparing their state to somebody else's state, I don't think you can say that, wanting power, people can want power for different reasons, I think, to be able to even control their own lives, so have autonomy over themselves. I think a lot of power is about that. When you say, I don't think I can readily decouple this intention of people wanting to be in somebody else's state versus people wanting to have power that other people have, unless you're wanting to pull them down.
Yeah. I think it's sloppy wording on my part. I agree. I think there can be a state of power that I'm trying to achieve as well. But I think there is fundamentally I think the difference still holds, but I think the wording is not right yet. In that I do think that there's a difference between the power we try to achieve, and there is something to the relative power we try to gain through revolution, say. But I think there is something different between maybe it's rather a difference in domains, right? Than just a difference in state versus power. In that maybe it's in the domains of my social identity relative to others and my power relative to others. Maybe it's like the state of my social group relative to others. Maybe there's something like that. That's a better way to think about it. Where as we start to expand beyond ourselves, the power we try to gain as a group might be something more akin to changing political states rather than the power we have as an individual. Maybe it's that one is purely social comparison for changes to systems, and the other one is social comparison to changes of self. And maybe this is a better distinction.
And do you think the one where people try to bring about changes to systems is necessarily better intentioned than gaining power for the self?
Yeah, not always. In that I can try to bring a change to the system by becoming an autocrat. But there is social comparison that we can make where our ability to compare ourselves to others is limited so that we don't enact change. But yeah, you're right in that it's definitely not an absolute, in that one leader might look at another leader and say, I want the power he has. And I think that happens.
It's usually a group, I think, also.
Yeah, that's fair. No, you're absolutely right.
Of power.
You're absolutely right. Maybe it doesn't hold that well.
And I think, even in the case of women trying to gain more power, it can start with a very benevolent intention of just gaining access into the libraries. But then at some point, feminists are also called feminazis because they become too aggressive in their want of power or even superseding the power of men. I think, the whole power thing just, it is really a matter of degree, after which it just gets a bit ugly, I think, in some sense. But I think people are always trying to, bring about some changes in that power dynamics, which is also one of the things that underlies how people consider fair systems.
So we have to try to understand which fairness is fair, right?
Yes. Which equation is fair?
No, because fairness is always about shifting power, right?
I think so, yeah. That's definitely one big aspect. Yeah.
And what you brought up is that if it's effective in shifting power, it can be a discourse, of power shifting for the power shifting itself. So we have to
explain that, please.
So it's basically, if we have to shift power from one side to the other in this equation, and this two works, so it can be misused, right? Because it depends on the perception on what's actually, which exactly this shift should be, and for how much it should be, and for how long, and for whom, and and we can go endless on the idea of tribalism and define what is our in-group. It's fair for all of us. It's fair for me. It's fair for a specific kind of person, and I don't know.
I think
you can go ahead.
No, I was saying that there's also this innate tendency in humans to always overcorrect. If they have been low in power, they are not just gonna want to get to the same power as the other group, let's say. They will also always want to sort of overcorrect because they think eventually that will equalize systems a little bit. But yeah, that's also a tricky thing when you try to balance out everyone's well-being, because the people who have been wronged will try to overcorrect, or if you give them the opportunity to have favors for a long time, the system itself will overcorrect, and then it will start becoming unjust towards the other groups which were in power before, which is the case that happens with reservations in India, actually.
I don't know if that's always the case. I don't think it's fair to say that the feminism will necessarily result in an unequal state. Or to say that all feminists will transition to a state in which they want an unequal state that just benefits them. I don't think that that's a fair assessment of resistance politics, whether it's social justice or for social justice in any domain. I think that there's an important thing of whether we value something like harmony, for lack of a better word, right? In that every time we make gains towards a more equal system, one side has to be making concessions, and the other side is going to be the beneficiary of those concessions. But we have to try to make sure that there is a sense where the concessions are not pushed too far, or that there is a benefit that the individuals see to actually making the concessions. I think that there is an innate value, an innate good that everybody gets from a more equal society. And it's whether or not we actually believe this. And some people don't believe it. Like fundamentally, they think, well, it's a system, humans are meant to compete, some have more than others, that's just the state of things. And whether you believe that or not is, I think, going to make a huge shift, have lasting repercussions for the divergence between your beliefs and the beliefs of somebody else. I fundamentally believe that people being more equal, it builds a better society for everybody. So I think if we're gaining, the more we put into the system to build more equality, the better the system's going to be to exist in, period.
I have a question to you. So this thing about having people wanting to do things for the greater good. So when a child is growing up, when the younger generation is coming up, at what stage and in what form do you think this sort of teaching can be given to children such that they're not looking out for the welfare of themselves, which is almost genetically wired, or the welfare of their families, but towards the greater good? When do you start talking about things like, you should be striving towards the good of, the society around you?
I think that the genetic argument is a difficult one to bring in, right? Because you could probably make the case that societal well-being is also genetically wired. So I would stay away from an essentialist genetics argument, especially because there's no good way to define like genetic inheritance in terms of that. But I would say that socially we do construct ways where we do tell children that sharing is caring. Right. This is fundamentally build a system where if other people have, you're also going to benefit. The root of sharing is caring, right? Which is taught at least in the United States, and I'm guessing everywhere else as well. That kids ought to share what they have because then the kids around them will also be happy. And then there's no problem of kids fighting over toys or food or anything like that. So the more we distribute resources, the better off everybody is. And I think this is an essential thing that we teach to kids.
I think this is also, so there was this experiment done by Daniel Nettle and Rebecca Sachs a few years ago. And this thing that you're talking about, where people would want to go for the larger good or greater harmony in society, also comes slightly from a position of privilege. When everything is calm, when there's no war, when there's no scarcity, when people are more or less not super different, not super heterogeneous, that is when people tend to show preferences for very equalistic or very, generous, egalitarian distribution of resources. And they did this experiment where they give different participants a story of this faraway hypothetical village, but they change how these villages are operating. So some participants will hear that this village is under war, under attack from another nearby village, or that they have faced a famine and the crops are lost, etc. And I think if you take into account that, of course, there's different countries who are facing a lot of these challenges across the world, then it's harder, and I think it's also unfair to ask people to be looking out for the greater good generally. I think their vision will get more and more narrowed down towards their own community, which might be a very small community, not the whole country. And yeah, I just wanted to bring up that example.
Yeah, no, I think it's still the right mentality. I think we still have to have people focusing on the greater good. The problem is that the more we hoard, the worse our situation is. If I don't have food, and the small food I have, I also restrict from other people, I start hoarding. That's also going to make my environment worse, because then there will be repercussions for me. Mm-hmm. The fact that it comes from a privileged position to say, yeah, we should work for the greater good is itself an argument to build in better systems for people to live in. One of the core things that works every time for an autocrat is make people more poor and make them focus on their needs. Because this is an understandable thing. Nobody blames anyone. I'm not blaming anyone for saying, I have needs. My needs aren't met. Therefore, I'm going to focus on meeting my needs first. There's this idea of in the airplane, when the air masks come in, put on your mask first so you can breathe, and then you can help other people put on their masks. This is sort of a fundamental aspect of economics when we try to understand how individuals are going to interact in a society. We can't say always, oh, help somebody else. The only time this seems to work really well is with siblings or children. Parents and children is obviously something where people help the children first because they see their children as extensions of them. Mm-hmm. So that's basically helping yourself, except yourself is embodied in another being. But yeah, I think that what we need to try to build is systems where people have more, so that the conversation can shift from meeting my own needs to building a better society. And this is a good case for things like basic income, right, across individuals. And again, because we're taking into account equity, right, systemic inequality, it doesn't mean giving everybody the same amount. It means to each as they require, which means some kind of graduated notion of basic income, which doesn't have provisions for people who are making $1 million to actually get basic income because they don't need it, right? Mm-hmm. In a system where we're trapped in this idea that everything has to be equal in order to be equal, we lose sight of the fact that the starting point is unequal. Mm-hmm. So if nobody pays the same amount of taxes. We have graduated tax rates. So we should also have graduated rates of basic income and provisions.
Which is actually a recent thing, the progressive taxes thing. It's not been there.
Yeah, I mean, and even then, so many nations are using tax brackets when we have computers that will do the calculation down to the penny of what you should give, and you can have the proportion that you give exponentially increase as you make more money, so that everybody has a different effective tax rate. And all these things work. I mean, you can calculate these, and we have computers do the calculations, but we're stuck in frameworks, obviously, because it's beneficial for some people over others, where you have loopholes and tax brackets that don't make any sense. But this is the system that we're living under, that we need to heavily reform. Not just with moderate amendments, but heavily reform in order to get people to start thinking about equitable systems.
Yeah, coming back to what Angarika's question was, I agree with all what you have been saying, actually. and I think that the greater good strive, it's fundamentally it should be fundamentally selfish. Actually, you should see how your life actually improves by everybody else's lives being improved. And I'm not so sure. Well, I tend to be a little bit balanced by the idea of a problem of scale. So yes, if we are, well, when we have families, we have obviously the engine of kin selection operating over there. So we are improving the extension of ourselves by helping them out, and it is conceivable on a small scale communities that the return for increased fairness within the system, it's an immediate return that we can kind of gauge remotely, even in kind of like self-esteem, because you like that person, you like your neighbor, you have a good relationship with your neighbor, you genuinely might be happy by improving their lives, and then it's kind of like affects you directly in a selfish way. That's okay. I like that everybody is happy around me, and that makes me happy as well. I'm not so sure if the problem of scale is actually a problem of scale or a problem of communication and miscommunication. So for people like in a really, really large group, it's not that if you would go Robin Dunbar's wrote, it's just that, okay, there's so much people, you cannot keep track of everything that's going on, every single relationship, like you just don't care. It's more than 150. My brain cannot do it. I believe that's not quite like that. I believe that it's harder to understand how you can be impacted by the improvement in the fairness in the system. So there is a problem with the communication within the scale, and then people can obviously take advantage of the process of communication and then take advantage. What I mean is gather a hoard power for themselves, and that kind of like disrupt a person's own perception of how their life is improving by improving fairness in the system. So that's my kind of perspective. So it is related to scale, but not the Dunbar wrote of there is too much social interactions to keep track of. But I think it's hard for us to understand how our life improves. So that's why we have in our discourse that, all that you have to do is be a better entrepreneur, and then meritocracy is going to act magically to make you rich, famous, and have all of everything that you ever dream. And without perceiving that, there is someone taking the whole cake anyways. So like you cannot conceive that, because the information is not reaching you in an appropriate way for you to understand that. So that's my understanding of it.
I think there are a few serious cognitive roadblocks there when you're talking about equitable systems or things that makes everyone feels fairly treated on a large scale. There are some serious roadblocks there, because this Robin Dunbar study of having this threshold number of people which your brain can keep track of is a problem. How do you see the greater good when you can't really visualize it so much? You can see communities being well off, sure, but like it's a bit difficult to visualize the whole world being greater good, and how on earth is that going to affect you? How on earth is that good for you? It's just a bit hard. Even I find it hard. And also the fact that we are not so future looking, like we are not super future looking animals, and especially if you put humans in scarcity situations.
How do you increase fairness for next generations, for example, right?
Yes, and that is something that a lot of people use, especially in the environmental debates. But still, it's hard. And what if people say, I don't want to have kids? Should I be doing things for like other people's kids? I don't know. But yeah, so that's one of the things that you can use to help people overcome this bias of the present moment, which is, I think, pretty strong. So I think these are important roadblocks to being able to implement what you are saying, which is a general good, and making everyone think about how others can eventually help you.
So let me introduce one idea. Immigration, right?
Okay.
You said we can't conceptualize greater good. Everybody can conceptualize immigration and border issues.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody is talking about building a wall between affluent countries. Why? Everybody understands that the livelihood of the individuals in those more affluent countries means that nobody wants to leave. Everybody does understand that their borders with less affluent countries will make those people want to move to theirs. This is the conceptualization on a very large scale of the greater good. So I very much disagree. I think humans are very capable of understanding this, right? We've built huge walls, arguments, systems of oppression built around the idea of saying we are going to exploit resources from these people and also build walls with those resources to keep them out. So this is crucial. If you look at the United States, and that is not to ignore all of Europe, which has these, again, also really draconian measures to make sure effectively that people drown when they're trying to cross borders. In the United States, the same thing. People are drowning, getting tied up in razor wire, getting shot by crazy locals on the American side of the border. There is no border wall on the Canadian side of the American border. There's a reason for that. Canada is also affluent. Canada is also a country that exploits, is also a privileged nation that exploits other nations. So, and the United States, instead of, you have two camps. Well, you have everything in between as well. But you have two camps on either end. One camp which says, we are going to hoard the resources and keep everybody else out. And so for that, nationalist narratives, racist narratives, false narratives about excessive violence, crop up to justify this position. And on the other side, the progressive position says, instead of spending all this money killing, torturing, interning people, building walls, why don't we just spend the money not on things that people might need in, say, Mexico in this exact case, but actually just giving Mexico the money and saying, you know what to do. You know, do something. Let's share some of what we have. And then you might solve some of the situation where people are crossing the border. And of course, it's not just people from Mexico, but all of Latin America, which the United States has historically exploited. So you have the system of, I'm going to take from everybody, and then I'm going to keep everybody out. And so I do think that when we start looking at large-scale social systems and how we construct our politics, we can see that individuals do innately understand these things, but are either actively avoiding it or, on the progressive end, actively fighting to understand that the greater good is better for everybody.
Yeah, my point was not that we are inherently bad on understanding the large-scale social dynamics on which we are embedded. What I was saying is that there is an inherent problem in communication of it.
I know, I completely agree with your point. I was kind of pushing back a bit more on Angarika, because I agree with you. I think the problem is communication. I think that that's the biggest hurdle.
I've forgotten what I was going to say.
Sorry.
No, wait, you were talking about, so another point that I wanted to get back to is, you're bringing up this example of immigration, and I agree that in that case, people are obviously able to sort of simulate what other people of a whole other country might do, whether be it Mexico or be it Canada or other European states. But then this thing that we talked about of humans having an innate sense of fairness, but also the people who are better off always trying to keep the resources to themselves, how do those two things come together? How can we explain them together?
Do you think that people are always keeping resources to themselves?
I think the ones in power don't want to lose power. So the United States does not really mind other affluent Canadians coming into their country, but they mind other not so affluent Mexicans coming into their country.
So this is the exact problem, is that you have different political opinions. You have there's 330 million people in the United States with vastly different opinions about what this is like. Some individuals who claim that they want the greater good, but just for Americans, which is an arbitrary distinction like every other nationality, and others on the progressive end of the spectrum, of which there are a large amount, who understand that actually building systems where everybody's benefiting from the resources that are available on the planet, we'll build a better planet for everybody. So I do agree that leaders in the United States have all been pretty fascist when it comes to this, have all been pretty right-wing regarding border policies, but that doesn't mean that that encompasses the entirety of the general public. And there is a large enough progressive end which fundamentally understands this.
Okay.
Yeah, I also think we should make a distinction between what's globalized and localized kind of issues. We talked about that before, and for my perspective is just that people, if it wasn't by the means of communication, like if it wasn't by media telling you about either the benefits or the potential problems of immigration, you would not have to form an opinion about immigration unless there is people actually coming to your village in the middle of nowhere. And then you kind of would form your opinion based on your interactions with these people that is coming into your village. So I don't think that there is the whole issue, not issue, but there is the whole level of imagining what are the nation's problems, which are actually not, or well, it becomes the people's problem, but it's not. It is a little bit far-fetched to imagine that that's how society should be operating. Like the nation is an artificial thing, so society should not be operating on this level. Well, our mental capacity should not be operating at this level, but at the level of the local or what we actually matters for us. And so people would not actually have an idea of immigration is good or bad unless they are interacting with immigrants that come to live on the next door. So everything else that they think about immigration, either if it's good or bad, it's because of communication. It's about how it is communicated for them, and then they get to a belief system on which encompass, okay, those are the aspects of immigration, this is how it affects my life, or how they imagine that affect their life, or how it does not.
Yeah, I mean, we have whole movements that are suppressed, like syndicalism, like internationalism, the Trotskyites of the 20th century, people who understand that the nation state is constructed and innately a negative force in that it creates artificial boundaries, creates systems of information dissemination and information withholding from general public. And this is this crucial thing about information, in that the information we are exposed to is both filtered by what we believe and impacts what we believe. And so there's this belief and perception dynamic that we have as information comes in, where the information comes in, is filtered by our beliefs. We call that perception, and then to some extent changes our beliefs. And this, I think, transitions well to some of the work that you and I have been doing together, Angarika, which is basically the cognition, the cognitive aspect, which is always itself motivated, to interpret situations as fair or unfair based on my relative position in that equation. Where you have in a household, which is what we've worked on, men who are unfairly advantaged by the systems of the household will see it as fair because they don't want to see themselves as oppressors or as overly privileged, and the women in the household will see it as fair because they don't want to see themselves as being taken advantage of. And I think that this is a very interesting aspect when we're trying to understand fairness, is the perception of fairness, which is, again, the subjective construction of the equation by each individual in it. The terms will be impacted, the values of the terms will be impacted by what benefits each person's conception of themselves.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that's something that we need to do as well. We haven't experimentally tested it out, but it would be nice to know. And I was just writing some stuff on communication generally. I think that's something that all three of us have agreed upon, that there has to be communication for people to understand the other's point of view and to eventually come to some sort of mutual acceptability. I'll just throw the term out there because that's going to be our larger theory of fairness, I think, at the end of my PhD or sometime after that. The mutual acceptability idea of Fairness, yeah. So if we have communication, if we are able to do some sort of grassroots investigation of what's going on and what people are actually facing, those should always be used to inform these larger ideals that we have and keep changing and tweaking the larger ideals in order to bring about things that most people are happy with, at least.
This comes back to, I think, a conversation that Guilherme and I've had plenty of times, which is about pragmatism, right? Because there's this idea of, when we look at the privileged class in any dynamic who are making concessions, you can hope that the entirety of the privileged class will be okay with the exact type and amount of concessions that you want them to make in order for the system to be equal. But that is very unlikely. And you can fight for that, which will be either in the soft end, nonviolent protest and resistance, in the extreme end, violence, right? You can try to demand it with physical force, which I think is always a negative outcome. But then there's this sort of ability to be vocal and resist, which I think is incredibly important and probably one of the most valuable things we can do. But then you have this discussion about pragmatism of, okay, what can we get in this moment which will not cause the privileged class we're asking concessions from to also in turn be violent in order to maintain. And I think we see this in the right wing in the United States. Sorry to keep bringing up the United States as an example, but it's a hotbed for all these really extreme things. But when you see and this is the concept of fragility used in critical theory, right? Which is that the privileged class, the fragility of them is this I think cognitive refusal to accept that they are privileged, and therefore when faced with their privilege, then get angry or violent. And this is a constant threat, and it kind of sucks to say, yeah, we need to also make concessions to the people we are asking concessions from. We need to worry about the feelings of the people who don't worry about anybody else's feelings. But that's the pragmatic reality on the ground.
Yeah, you can't ask people to just give up their houses and their stuff without also thinking about how they might feel about giving up.
Well, one of the houses only. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's true.
If you have two houses, Guilherme wants one of them. Yeah.
It's only one of them. They don't have to give up their houses.
Yeah.
The main one. They can give up the other ones.
The ones that they
their
don't
vacation
use it
homes.
anyways, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, and this is where, in the same way that we don't see the immediate effects of climate change in some places in the world, we can conceptualize them and understand that we are making a detriment to the global climate. We can also, I think, work to build in systems of equity where it's gradual, and we don't immediately take your house, but we will make sure that your grandchild doesn't have 5 houses.
Yeah.
And I think that we can build systems like this, but we haven't tried yet. And there are proposals, but they haven't succeeded yet. But the fact that things are gradual and slow, and the human race has time, right? Hundreds of millions of years to figure this shit out.
Well, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully, that we can actually build equitable systems that are at least as slow as climate change, or maybe even hopefully not as slow, because I think global disaster is pretty imminent. So it's pretty fast in our lifetimes, but I'd say pretty slow over the course since the Industrial Revolution. But maybe equality and equity, maybe we can build that in faster.
I think, I mean, it's harder to change adults anyway, and it's easier to mold the minds of younger people. So if you teach a young person to not expect all of the 5 houses that their grandparents had, I think that's an easier task to accomplish than having this person who has built 5 houses over the course of his lifetime, asking him at 60 years of age to give everything up.
It's a communication thing again. Can you control the information well enough? And then there's this other side conversation that my buddy Michael and I have gotten into a million times, which is what is manipulation, and when is manipulation okay, and when is it actually manipulation, and if it's for the greater good, is it manipulation? This is sort of in the same way that we talk about fairness. maybe there's a similar way to look at when messaging has a particular incentive. And maybe we'll do some kind of conversation later about whether or not there's a difference between information and propaganda. But yeah.
That'll be interesting. Yeah, that's definitely interesting. Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to tell us about your field or your work before we sign off?
My field and my work. I think one thing I would definitely like more and more people to know, however many people listen to your podcast, is that it's incredibly valuable to do the things of a bottom-up qualitative approach to things, especially like moral psychology and moral cognition, along with doing the more theoretical stuff, which moral philosophy has been doing for like decades and centuries. I don't know how old moral philosophy is, but that was probably one of the first
millennia.
I would do that, yeah.
Millennia. Okay, sorry, not decades actually. Yeah, sorry. But yeah, the one thing that I have learned from my PhD and hopefully will keep building on is this amazing insights you get when you do both the bottom-up and the top-down sort of approaches together, and how that can really help in addressing things at a broader theoretical level, but also at the individual levels, which can impact lives in a more meaningful way. And I would just like to put out there that I love working with anthropologists and sociologists along with doing stuff in cognitive science, because I think cognitive science is important. But I really enjoy the way that anthropologists look at human beings.
And can you give us a quick sense of what you mean by top-down and bottom-up in this particular research context?
So, for example, one of our studies, I'm just going to give you examples of two studies which are going in literally the opposite direction. One was we have this bargaining model, a Nash bargaining model of how outside options can influence people's decisions about how they distribute labor. So we've been using the model to see how hunter-gatherers, how much we can explain of the hunter-gatherers division of labor using the bigger model, and then realizing that we have to abstract away from a lot of things to be able to fit the data into the model. And the other bottom-down approach was doing vignette studies and giving people very real-life scenarios and asking them to make decisions of fairness within those vignettes, and then coming up with, from the data, trying to come up with a theory of what exactly is it that people look for when they are given real-life situations and they're asked to judge fairness in these real-life situations. So, yeah.
One last question unless also you have anything.
No, go ahead.
Which is, say you had the lifespan and the stamina to work for 1,000 years. What's the dream theory or thing that you'd come to understand through your research? You know, what's the driving thing where you're like, I really wish humans understood this thing?
So what I would like to put out for other people, or no, what do you mean?
Maybe an individual driving question. Like for me, it's really understanding that core mechanism of belief, identity, this sort of, what would that be for you if you're like, okay, I can't do this in my lifetime. I'm hoping to contribute in a small way to humans' understanding of this thing. What is this thing?
For me, it would be a methodological question. For me, it would be something to do with how best to understand and study human beings. And what are the methodological tools to do that? Not just methodological, but also how to communicate with different people, how to have conversations, how to test those conversations, how to, interpret those conversations. It's just, I think it's a lifelong goal to really, in all fairness, in all completion, try to understand even one human being if it's completely possible. So I think, the methodological part of that.
Right on. Do you have an answer to why we should try to understand human beings?
Why?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Because I think that's a really great answer. I mean, understanding how to understand human beings is like a crucial thing that I think all of us are grappling with as cognitive scientists. But what do you have an answer for why you think that's important?
Why? I mean, there's so many things, but I think it's important because I am going to be a human being, and my most relevant... No, that's not actually true. I don't know. Why is it relevant? I think given the fact that I look at my life at least and being contained within academia, and within academia looking at human I don't know, actually. How would I answer that question of why it's relevant? Doesn't it seem very obvious, very intuitively obvious that we would really want to understand human beings? That's what I study for my work. That's what I do for, living a life. I talk to people all the time.
Maybe this is a false dichotomy. Is it more that you think humans are beautiful, or more that you think it'll better the lives of human beings? And it can be neither.
I think both.
Yeah,
Humans are beautiful, and I would really like to have an impact in bettering, in some ways, others' lives as well. So yeah,
Right
I
on.
think if we can understand how to understand them, really, what tools to use to understand them, then we can figure out how to make. I think making someone feel understood is also a really beautiful thing. And if we can use that to change some lives, that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll end there. That's a great way to.
That was perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Angarika.
Thank you for having me.